Alright, what's going on guys? Today, we are finally going to start upgrading these Dominaria Planeswalker decks. In this video, I'll show you how to upgrade the Teferi Timebender deck. As always, do keep in mind, these are not intended to be tier 1 competitive decks. If you want that, consider checking out the latest tournament results. What we'll be doing is upgrading this deck card by card, sticking to this deck's themes, and doing it on a budget, as we will not exceed the deck's original MSRP price with our upgrades. Also, since Kaladesh and Amonkhet will be rotating out of Standard soon, I am not going to include those sets in my upgrades. We'll only be using Ixalan through Core Set 2019, so you can continue using this deck after Standard rotates. Anyway, let's get started. The Teferi Timebender Planeswalker deck is a blue-white historic deck, as you can see with cards like Joyra's Familiar and Daring Archaeologist. The Familiar reduces the cost of historic spells, and the Archaeologist gets a +1/+1 counter each time you cast one. The deck contains a variety of historic cards, which is to say artifacts and legendary creatures, though not a single saga to be found, so that's interesting. Anyway, the unique cards that come with the deck, the cards that you can only get by purchasing it, are Teferi himself, along with Teferi's Sentinel and Niambi Faithful Healer. And as usual, the deck also contains plenty of terrible cards that we can replace in order to power it up. I'm talking about things like, however you pronounce this, I asked on Twitter, didn't get a response. Ether Glider, I'm just going to ignore that S. The S doesn't exist. Ether Glider, Knight of New Benalia, and Teferi's Sentinel are all pretty terrible. The Glider is a 2/1 flyer that can't block for 3 mana. Pretty bad. The Knight is a generic 3/1 for 2. It's unplayable. We can get better stuff for 2 mana. And the Sentinel can be okay with Teferi in play, but most of the time it's an ultra clunky 2/6 for 5 whole mana. Yeah, we can find much more powerful things to replace these bad cards with. So let's get to the upgrades. The first thing I want to do is take out the 2 Juggernauts and replace them with Traxxas Scourge of Kruge. Both of these cost 4 mana, but one is a 5/3 that has to attack every single turn, even into opposing blockers, and the other is a larger 7/7 with trample that can occasionally get stuck in the tapped position. So both do have drawbacks, but the Juggernaut will attack into defenders and die very regularly, and the Traxxas, not only can it be untapped by the majority of our deck, because we are playing a historic deck, but we also have a clever solution for it. That's because we're going to replace 3 Knight of New Benalias for 3 Voltaic Servants. So once again, we have the same mana cost. Both of these cost 2, but the Knight of New Benalia doesn't trigger any of our historic stuff. It's not an artifact, it's not a legendary creature, it's not a saga, so the Servant is on theme, but also it untaps an artifact at the end of every turn, including Traxxas. So not only does this eliminate Traxxas' drawback, it actually improves the creature because Voltaic Servant untaps it at the end of our turn. So Traxxas kind of has vigilance. That is to say, we can attack with it, and at the end of turn, we untap it, and we have a 7/7 to block with. Pretty sweet. Next up, we're going to take out 2 Ether Gliders, because that S doesn't exist, and replace them with 1 copy each of Voltaic Servant and Traxxas. This gives us 3 Traxxas and 4 Voltaic Servants. So hopefully, we can smash face with this giant legendary robot dragon thing on a fairly regular basis. Next up, we're going to take out the single Sara Angel and replace it with Zahid Jin of the Lamp. While Sara Angel is a classic card, it's not technically historic, so let's replace it with a legendary creature, and a good one to boot. So Zahid costs 1 more to cast, a total of 6 mana, but if we have an artifact, we can tap it and only pay 4 mana for it. So it's a turn 4 5/6 flyer, and we have plenty of artifacts to tap too, which means we should consistently start dishing out tons of damage in the air every single game. It's either this or Traxxas. You know, ideally turn 4, we're either going to have a 7/7 with trample that hopefully untaps every turn, or a 5/6 with flying. Similarly, we're also going to take out Tatsuko Umezawa for another Zahid. Tatsuko just doesn't do anything in this deck. I mean, sure, it did make the Knight of New Benalia unblockable, and that's kind of okay, but also, Knight of New Benalia is a terrible card, so it's pretty mediocre overall. I mean, don't get me wrong, we could probably build a pretty janky deck around Tatsuko, but it's just not this deck. I don't want to build this entire deck. I mean, it's not even historic. You're trying to make 1 toughness or 1 power creatures unblockable, and that's fine. It's just, it doesn't really do anything within the confines of a historic deck. So, Zahid it is. Next up, we'll take out 2 Relic Runners for 2 more Sparring Constructs. I honestly don't think either of these cards are fantastic, but Relic Runners is a pet peeve card type for me. That is to say, it's a card that's built around the theme, but then doesn't contribute to that theme. Relic Runners gets better in a historic deck, but it doesn't contribute to the historic theme because it itself isn't historic. So let's get a couple constructs in. They also are kind of, you know, so-so, but they can be tapped to play Zahid, so that's important. Just a 1 mana artifact is definitely useful, and the +1/+1 counter on Traxxas or Zahid. Also, you know, why not just make those things smash face even faster? Next, we'll take out 3 Teferi's Sentinels for 3 Wrath Compassions. As mentioned earlier, the Sentinels are only good if Teferi is out, and even then it feels pretty mediocre. But Wrath is pretty spicy. The best part about it is that it allows us to cast our creatures at instant speed, because it gives them all flash. And that allows us to hold up mana for things like counter magic and removal spells. It also allows us to play creatures as surprise blockers, which can really put our opponent off their game. I mean, heck, you could even cast Wrath himself with flash to untap Traxxas by surprise. So basically, this card just allows you to be super sneaky and devious. And whenever you have it in play, or just, you know, if your opponent knows that it's in your deck, you know, it'll really set them on edge because it adds a lot of complexity and, you know, kind of trickery during the combat phase and whatnot, so that's kind of fun. Next up, we're going to take out 1 Befuddle for 1 Seal Away. The problem with Befuddle is it's a temporary solution to a problem. You know, like if you really needed to save your life, well, it's only going to put off the inevitable for a single turn, so why not deal with the problem permanently with Seal Away? It exiles an attacking creature practically forever. Granted, it doesn't work against creatures with vigilance, but most of the time, it'll do the trick. Next up, we're going to take out the other Befuddle for a 4th copy of Gideon's Reproach. This is similar to Seal Away. Why not deal with a problem permanently? Again, there is a restriction in that it doesn't deal with big creatures, but then that's true for Befuddle as well. But most of the time, you'll be able to blow up most of the things that are swinging at you, and all for just 2 mana. Seal Aways would be better for sure, and if you have extra copies of those, I would definitely recommend replacing as many Reproaches for Seal Aways as you can. But for now, this will do. Next up, we're going to take out 3 Temporal Machinations and replace them with 3 Syncopates. This is another instance of replacing a temporary solution for a permanent one. Do you really just want to bounce a creature and let your opponent recast it, or just counter it outright? As I mentioned earlier, Wrath Compassion allows us to leave up mana for counterspells, and if our opponent doesn't cast anything threatening, then we can just deploy our own threats at the end of their turn. So that makes playing counter magic really convenient. You don't have to decide between, you know, should I play my threat or should I wait and hold up mana for counterspell. If you have Wrath in play, you can always leave up your mana for counterspell every turn, and if they don't cast anything that's, you know, a problem, then great, don't worry about it, and you can cast your own creature on their turn. Very convenient. So Syncopates are great with Wrath. We're also going to replace 1 Divination for 1 Opt. Divination is just not great. I mean, don't get me wrong, drawing cards is the best thing you can do in Magic, but basically dedicating an entire turn and only getting 1 card ahead is you know, it's less than stellar. Instead, for a single mana, we can scry and draw with Opt, which doesn't give us card advantage, but it does allow us to dig through our deck, so we can more consistently find things like Traxxas, Zahid, and Voltaic Servant. It'll help out a lot in terms of early game consistency, so we can more frequently get out our big guys. It's definitely what we want, just, you know, kind of sculpt our early game, hopefully find those big guys so we can get them out on turn 4. And yep, we'll continue with that. We'll take out the last Ether Glider, because that S still doesn't exist, and Temporal Machination for 2 more ops. Consistency is good. This will help a lot in that regard. The final change I want to make is to remove 3 lands for 3 Traveler's Amulets. This deck is packing a whopping 26 lands. 26! That's a ton of lands. Practically no deck ever needs 26 lands. So using Traveler's Amulets, it allows us to cut lands, but the amulets let us search for more lands. So we'll be flooded with lands less often, and also we can thin out our deck of lands every single time we use one of these. More importantly, the most important thing about this is that it's another artifact that's a 1-drop, so we can tap it for Zahid. So it's something that we can put into play on turn 1 or turn 2 or whatever, and it can sit around for a couple turns, get a Zahid in play, and then we can crack it, get a land. And another thing, if we top deck it in the late game, you know, it's not great, but it can untap a Traxxas, so it has some extra benefit there. So yeah, it just gives us some utility with our big beaters that we want to win the game with. But also, you know, it works as a nice little replacement for these excess lands that we have in the deck. So anyway, that's it for our upgrades. If you want to spend a little bit more money, the things you want to consider are History of Benalia, Lyra Dawnbringer, Shalai, Voice of Plenty, and Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. I mean, these cards are very powerful. Lyra Dawnbringer in particular is pretty insane. A 5/5 flying first strike and lifelink for 5 mana isn't bad at all, but these cards are very, very expensive. Also, if you want to upgrade the mana base, Glacial Fortress is the way to go. Dual lands definitely would be nice, but you know, those are also very expensive. But yeah, there you go guys. This was a long one, and I will fully admit this build is a little bit janky. The problem with Historic is there isn't nearly enough support for it as there should have been. I mean, there's a lot of like Historic Matters cards, but just not a lot of like really good pushed Historic cards to kind of, you know, get a lot of benefit out of that. Even the Historic deck, like the tier 1 competitive Historic deck, it's basically just a blue-white control deck that has a few Historic cards in it. There's no like Historic synergy. You know, it plays History of Benalia and Teferi, but like, there's not a lot of Historic Matters cards in it. Not a whole lot anyway, I don't think. So yeah, it's a little bit janky. Nevertheless though, this deck is definitely fun to pilot. There is some consistency issues, but it's definitely way more powerful than what came out of the box. So if you've been playing this thing without these upgrades, you should get a lot more power at your disposal with Zahids and Traxxas and whatnot. So yeah, it's definitely an upgrade. It's definitely more powerful. Also, our total investment is like $11 or so USD. I know that's not relevant to everyone, but for people outside the US, the MSRP price on these is $15 and our upgrade cost is like $11. So, you know, that should hopefully scale proportionally depending on where you're from. Anyway, it's not very much and it's definitely a lot more powerful. So anyway, yep, if you guys try these upgrades, let me know how it went in the comments. And in the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.